There are more copies?
There are more copies. I put some on the table. Okay, so welcome to the 10:15 Friday morning session. Good for you for all getting out. I woke up very early to cook for Shabbos so that I could come and enjoy some of the sessions after that. What I'm going to be talking about today is sexuality and sanctity and a little bit of background so you know, I know it's in your booklets in case you didn't read it up on who I am and how I come to this topic. I've been studying rabbinic text for many years. I made Aliyah 25 years ago. Still an American immigrant. For those who have been there that long, you know that you never fully lose the American piece. You always are a little one step behind. A few years ago I started studying to be, the story actually begins at Pardes. Pardes is a non-denominational Beit Midrash, men, women, Jews from all walks of Judaism who come to this fantastic place where they have like an open Beit Midrash. There are classes, communal classes, and year-long programs, and there's information here. If you want to sign up and be on our email list, there are online courses as well. And a few years ago, Danny Landis, who was then the Rosh Yeshiva, approached me and said, look, no one here really is teaching Nida, no one here is really teaching brides, and I have a couple that need someone to teach them. How do you feel about it? Well, I hadn't really studied formally, I'd been practicing, and I really studying Nida formally, and I took on the challenge, and it was successful, and I realized I wanted to be that voice in the non-Orthodox community as well as in the Orthodox community. Meaning I wanted to be a resource for people who are thinking about Nida, mikvah, sexuality in a sanctified way, even if it was outside the halachic discourse. And so I went for 2 years to study at Nishmat to become what's called a Yowetz Halacha. I studied probably even more than rabbis normally do in this area because it was a group of women and we were studying and being tested and so on to represent the halachic community. In addition, I took a lot of classes with sex therapists, psychologists, people in the field of sexuality, and so we were getting both the Jewish piece and the kind of the professional piece. And then I started teaching. I started teaching brides and grooms and brides, and I began to realize, along with many other people almost simultaneously, that there had been somewhat of a myth that if you saved yourself, if you followed the given party line, which is no premarital sex, or feel very guilty about anything you do before marriage, and get married and use the mikvah, and then the Garden of Eden awaits you, and so on, that it was much more complicated. That although Judaism, as we're going to see today, is a very carnal religion, it's a religion that very much promotes and believes and emphasizes sexuality. That doesn't mean that automatically people find sexual pleasure in their committed relationships, and there's tremendous mitzukah. See, this is where I've been here for 25 years. Not danger, distress, that's the word, distress. And there have been many centers that have opened up in the last 5 years. Yahel is one of them, Eden is another, where they have begun more aggressively training teachers of brides and grooms, rabbis, educators, to be much more effective resources in helping couples navigate. And again, I've kind of gone out of the box by helping couples who are not only the kind of the classic married heterosexual model, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. I've taken 2 classes as a sex educator as well. So I'm a Yowetz Halacha, I studied the Halacha, but I've also studied, again, as an educator, a more detailed, deeper understanding of sexuality. And with that, I stand before you. I was in the States in August, wonderful place to take vacation, and I was sitting in the nail salon with my daughters waiting for their manicures, and I picked up Vanity Fair of September 2015, and they had an article called Tinder is the Night. And if I had the PowerPoint, I would have shown it to you. Tinder and the Dawn of the Dating Apocalypse. And I'm just going to read you the first page of the article because it's very significant. And when we talk about sanctity and sexuality, I believe that sexual relationships can be sanctified even if they're not the well-trodden rabbinic path. But I don't think what I'm about to read to you can be sanctified in any way. And yet this is the challenge people have, because sex has become a lot like junk food. You walk into the supermarket, you have choices to make. There's the healthy food, and then in all the colorful wrappings are the tasty cakes and devil dogs, and when you walk into a supermarket in America, there are aisles and aisles of exciting looking junk food, and it's very compelling and very catching. And so that's what's happening with sex. And I'm going to read to you the opening again. I apologize, I had it on PowerPoint. It's a balmy night in Manhattan's financial district, and at a sports bar called Stout, everyone is Tindering. The tables are filled with young women and men who have been chasing money and deals on Wall Street all day, and now they're out looking for hookups. Everyone is drinking, peering into their screens, and swiping on the faces of strangers they may have sex with later that night. Or not. Ooh, this guy has dad bod, a young woman says, a potential match, swiping left. Her friends smirk, not looking up. Tinder sucks, they say, but they don't stop swiping. At a booth in the back, 3 handsome 20-something guys in button-downs are having beers. They are Dan, Alex, and Marty, budding investment bankers at the same financial firm, which recruited Alex and Marty straight from an Ivy League campus. When asked if they've been arranging dates on the apps they've been swiping at, all say not 1 date, but 2 or 3. You can't be stuck in one lane, there's always something better. If you had a reservation somewhere and then a table at Per Se opened up, you'd want to go there, Alex offers. Guys view everything as a competition, he elaborates with his deep, reassuring voice. Who's slept with the best, hottest girls? With these dating apps, he says, you're always sort of crowded. You can talk to 2 or 3 girls at a bar and pick the best one, or you can swipe a couple hundred people a day. The sample size is so much larger. It's setting up 2 or 3 Tinder dates a week, and chances are sleeping with all of them. So you can rack up 100 girls you've slept with in a year. He says that he himself has slept with 5 different women he met on Tinder, Tinderellas, the guys call them, in the last 8 days. Dan and Marty, also Alex's roommates in a shiny high-rise apartment building near Wall Street, can vouch for that. In fact, they can remember who Alex has slept with in the past week more readily than he can. I skipped some of the article, and yet a lack of intimate knowledge of his potential sex partners never presents him with an obstacle to physical intimacy, Alex says. Alex, his friends agree, is a Tinder king. A young man of such deft text game, that's the ability to actually convince someone to do something over text, Marty explains, he is able to entice young women into his bed on the basis of a few text exchanges. So what's happening here, and then it goes on to talk a little bit about what used to be, people used to meet their partners through family, through friends. Internet meeting is surpassing every other form. A woman in New York calls this the dating apocalypse. Mobile dating went mainstream about 5 years ago. Since 2012, it's overtaken online dating. In February, one study reported there were nearly 100 million people, nearly 50 million on Tinder alone, using their phones as a sort of all-day, everyday handheld singles club, where they might find a sex partner as easily as they find a cheap flight to Florida. It's like ordering Seamless, says Dan, the investment banker, referring to the online food delivery service, but you're ordering a person. And I mean, again, if you're interested, you can Google the article, you can find it online. Somewhere in the middle, is this good for women? I'll talk a little bit about that in general, about the hookup culture. But when you read something like that and you realize that that's become, 50 million people on Tinder, and all they do are swipe pictures, you're not even having the conversation where you buy a woman a beer or a man a beer at the bar. You're not even having that. You're literally meeting them on your app, deciding whether they look attractive, making up to meet within your apartment, his apartment, and going up and having very, very casual sex. And so I think that it's important to recognize that the culture today has become not just promiscuous, because it's kind of surpassing that. Sex has become a lot like food services for many young people in a very modern kind of fast world. The other article or a big event that's come to my attention is AshleyMadison.com. Has everyone heard about that? Something like, again, tens of millions of people who went online to have affairs. Life is short, have an affair was their motto. And apparently they have been blackmailed by a hacker who threatened to expose their entire database. When they didn't do what he wanted, he exposed it. A friend of mine yesterday, I have not confirmed this, but said there were 24,000 accounts from Modi'in. Which is here. Meaning they were all over the world. It was government officials, it was policemen. Apparently two high officials have committed suicide, meaning the downfall from this, where people can now see you've been exposed as having an account, even if you didn't do anything. Because it turns out there were very few women on the account. And there was a lot of manipulation of information. It was very interesting. Again, more and more information is coming out about this. But people have been obviously humiliated, their lives have been ruined. Perhaps a lesson not to trust any online accounts for such intimate information. But I think when we talk about sanctity, and again, I I listen to the rabbinic discourse, and a lot of the rabbinic discourse is, let's limit sexuality and in the dark and very specific positions and so on and so forth. We have much bigger problems facing us, and those problems are Tinder and Ashley Madison, and not whether a couple decides to kind of shake it up in the beginning by trying something completely new and keeping their sexuality exciting and desirous and something that really brings them together and intimate and personal. And I think that part of what I'm going to talk about today is that Judaism has a very rich tradition of sexuality, and I would say in the last 1,000 years. And again, I'm not saying this as an academic, I'm saying this kind of as intuition, although I'm sure someone has proven this. Christianity obviously came along and affected part of the way we feel about sexuality, and we're going to see that as we go through the sources. Okay, if you take out your source sheet, source number 1. So what we're going to look at first are basically some very stories are the best way really to look at what the Talmud has to say. I'm going back 2,000 years to the Talmudic time, and I'm going to bring a few stories that we're going to look at that I think are particularly revealing before we go on to the section I call Kedoshim to you. You shall sanctify yourself because I, God, is sanctified. Just to remind you, the laws of sexual prohibitions in the Torah, in the Bible, appear in chapters 18 and 20. Prohibition in chapter 18 of Leviticus, the punishments, largely death, with some excommunication thrown in. Largely incest, adultery, bestiality, and homosexuality. Again, very painful verses for those who are struggling with homosexuality. Premarital sex does not appear there. Neither does father-daughter sex, which again, the Talmud obviously comes in and says, oh, obviously that's a big taboo. Scholars find that particularly interesting because you can think about that. Do I have any more source sheets? I don't know. You might have to share. Are there any extra sources?
I have 2. That's great.
This was supposed to be on the computer, but nobody else.
Anybody else need a source sheet? Yes.
Okay, so again, I'm back. I'm rolling back before we look at the stories, because it's important to recognize that sexual relations are a means of sanctifying oneself before God. Because once a woman is not menstruating, and she is not one of the prohibited relationships, incest, adultery, and so on and so forth, then part of drawing close to God or being holy is having a sanctified sexual relationship. Okay, so I'm pointing out that the Torah itself endorses a sexual relationship as long as you follow certain rules. Okay, we'll get back to that. Source number 1. Rav Kahana once went in and hid under Rav's bed. A classic story, many of you may have heard it. It's a very funny story. The Talmud has a lot of humor about these topics. Rav Kahana is the student of Rav, and he goes and hides under his teacher's bed. He heard him chatting with his wife and joking and doing what he required, which again is foreplay. He's joking around, they're joking, they're chatting, it's like a whole thing. And then, Osat Shrachav, and then he has the actual sexual, the intervals. He said to him, one would think Abba's mouth had never sipped the dish before. So Kahana is shocked by this. And as he's lying there under the bed, he's not really supposed to reveal himself, he speaks aloud and he says, again, interesting that he calls him Abba, because we know that the teacher-student relationship is often in some ways even more intimate than the parent-child, or can be. And so here, it's as if he's under his father's bed. And he's listening to something he clearly shouldn't be listening to, and he's like, why is it taking so long? They've been married for years. Like, isn't this just a, let's go in and get the mitzvah done kind of thing? What's going on? And Kahana, he says to him, Kahana, are you here? Get out, because it's rude. He replied, it's a matter of Torah, and I require to learn. So again, the visual's fantastic. There are 2 points I want to point out. Rav, who's one of the biggest scholars, one of the biggest Talmud scholars in Babel, in Babylonia, is taking a long time to have sex with his wife. And what is he doing? He's talking to her. They're chatting and they're joking, and there's a build-up, and only then do they have the relationship. So again, it's not just about going in and getting the job done, either for procreation purposes or to pleasure your wife, which we'll get to. There is a mitzvah to give your wife sexual pleasure, but he's going well beyond that in creating an intimate environment. And Kahana's shocked. Kahana may very well not be married. It seems like perhaps he's not married at this point and not involved in a sexual relationship. And he really thinks, well, you go, and how much time do you want to waste? Let's get back to the baby crush, Abba. And Abba basically tells him, or Rav tells him, you shouldn't be here. This is rude. And he says, no, this is Torah. And Kahana's right. It is Torah. He's right and he's wrong. He should be under his Rebbe's bed. But he's right in the sense that he should learn how to have good sex. That's part of the Torah's mandate. Okay, story number 1. Story number 2. Again, a very famous story, but really, really relevant for this class. There was once a man who was particularly careful about the commandment of tzitzit. He heard, and now again, of course, tzitzit is supposed to protect you from your eyes going astray. We say it every day in Shema, in the 3rd paragraph, right? Lo tatur acharei einechem, you shall not deviate after your eyes, as you talk about the mitzvah tzitzit. And while the simple meaning is you shall not go follow other gods, the word zanu, which is a word for promiscuity, appears in that paragraph of Shema, and the author of this story decided to bring a prostitute into a story about tzitzit. It's fantastic. Okay. He heard there was a prostitute in a town by the sea who took 400 gold pieces as her price. And if we realize that 200 silver zuz is enough for a woman to support herself for a year, that's the price of the ketubah for a virgin woman, 400 gold pieces is like at least twice that, if not more. Because we're talking gold as opposed to zuz, which wouldn't have been gold, right? So it's a lot of money. It's a lot of money. He sent her 400 gold coins and set a time to come to her. When his time came, he went. She said, let him come in. When he entered, she had prepared for him 7 beds. Note, again, these stories are fantastic. Every detail has symbolism. 7 beds, 6 of silver, 1 of gold. Again, the days of the week, Shabbat, the 7th day, right? The climax, the ultimate experience is on the 7th bed. She went up and sat naked on the top bed. So again, visually, the Talmud does not hold back. We are there in the room, on the 7th bed. As he was climbing to sit up with her, the 4 strings of his tzitzit smacked him in the face, which is also fantastic, because the understanding is he's naked except for his tzitzit. He's climbing up the ladder so fast, tzitzit come up and smack him in the face. It became very funny. They had a sense of humor. He fell, so you feel like he's bumping down all the ladders, right, until he gets to the bottom. And she came down and said, by the city of Rome, I will not let you rest until you tell me what blemish you saw in me. Again, wow, 2015, how many women blame themselves? Well, what's wrong with me? Why don't you fancy me tonight? Why don't you want to go out with me again? What's wrong with me? Am I not pretty enough, right? I have 4 daughters, believe me, all day I hear, am I not pretty enough? Am I not thin enough? And that's in 2015 with a mother who's a feminist, right? And yet, they're constantly worried, there must be something about me. You have a prostitute who takes 400 pieces of gold. She's been paid. She doesn't even need to do the job. And she wants to know what blemish do you see in me. Actually, a very insightful line about women's character. He said, I've never seen a more beautiful woman than you. But there is one commandment that God commanded us, and tzitzit is its name. Now the tzitzit are witnesses against me. He says, look, suddenly as I was racing up the ladders, I was mindful of my tzitzit. And what can I do? They protected me from doing this sin. She said to him, I will not let you rest until you tell me what your name is, the name of your city, the name of your teacher, the name of the school in which you learned this Torah. He wrote it down. He exits stage right. She got up and divided her possessions, 1/3 for the government, 1/3 for the poor, 1/3 she kept, including the sheets from the bed. She is a true heroine. She is the heroine of the story, not him. Why? Because as she is about to change her life, and apropos of this week's parsha, where a man takes a captive woman and transitions her into his house, right? So she is forced to join the Israelite household. Here is a woman who, of her own volition, pays her taxes, 1/3 to the government, and before she skips town, she gives 1/3 to the poor, and then she keeps 1/3. Now, she's a very wealthy woman, so obviously there was plenty to keep, but I find it very impressive that they make it, that in the story, they make it clear she pays her taxes. And obviously charity. And she takes the sheets. Now, the sheets obviously being very erotic, very erotic sin. She came to the Beit Midrash of Rabbi Chia. So it's not that she's going to stop being a prostitute. She hasn't forgotten the tricks of her trade. She's not putting on a sackcloth. She's taking the sheets of her bed. Okay, that's an important piece. We'll get to it. She said, Rabbi, command me and make me a convert. So he's a little suspicious. This unbelievably beautiful, sensual woman has come to convert. He said to her, my daughter, have you set your eyes on one of the students? Maybe you're converting because you've fallen in love with one of my students. She took out the paper and gave it to him. So basically, enough said, he gets the picture, he understands, obviously he's a serious, rabbi, and he understands immediately what's going on, and he says, go and enjoy your purchase. And for those who study ketubot with me, blessed in the front, you know that largely women are purchased, meaning if we're going to be cynical, women are taken or acquired in the act of kiddushin, right? A man acquires a wife 3 ways, kesef, shtar, bia, with money, with a document, or through sexual relations. So largely in the stories in ketubot, where a man comes to question his wife's virginity, actually a wonderful selection of stories, again, we don't have time to say everything, Rabban Gamliel largely smacks him on the head and says, who do you think you are? Go take your acquisition, right? I mean, it's a slap on him. It's not really meant to be a put down on her. But the idea is, who do you think you are coming in challenging? You made a commitment. You're now stuck with it. Go home and be with your wife. This is the only place that I believe in the Talmud where the woman is told, you've done something so heroic and so masculine in some ways. Meaning what you've done is normally what you go enjoy your acquisition. Meaning you are now going to acquire this yeshiva student. You have risen above. The sheets which she had spread for him in prohibition, she now spread for him lawfully. A very important last line. She will now use all the tricks of her trade, but in marriage, and he will be able to enjoy them. So again, a lovely last line to the story that the sheets are now going to go into the marital bed, into the marital home, and she will be able to spread them lawfully. Okay, so again, a lovely story that seems to emphasize the idea that sexual pleasure in marriage is something that can very much be sanctified. Bereshit Rabbah 9, again a midrash. God saw all he had done, and behold, it was very good. It's a midrash on the pasuk in the beginning of Bereshit. Nachman, in the name of Rabbi Shmuel, says he has a commentary, an interpretation. It was very good. Why did God need to see that it was very good? Why wasn't good enough? This is the good inclination, the Yetzer HaTov. And behold, this extra word and, because God saw all he had done, behold, it was very good. Like the word vav, the extra vav, opens the door for an interpretation. And behold, it was very good. This is the evil inclination. And is the evil inclination very good? Rather, without the evil inclination, a person would not build a house and not marry a woman and not beget children. Now, I'm not saying one of the students, when I taught this, I gave this class, and Renee said, well, it's very difficult that they call the sexual attraction or sexual desire evil inclination. This is 450 CE. I'll already say at this point, Christianity has decided Judaism is a very carnal religion. They don't want to have anything to do with it. The ideal in Christianity, of course, is celibacy. But what can we do? Men are men, again, largely because men cannot control their desires, will allow, sexual relations cannot be eradicated and at least concentrated on having children. What can you do? Judaism is saying something very significant in this source. This is in around 450 CE. Without the evil, you can call it whatever you want. You want to call it an evil inclination. You feel uncomfortable because you feel there's something very base and very primitive about sex. Without it, the person would not build a house, not marry a woman, not beget children. At the end of the day, there's no way to avoid it. Sexuality is here to say the sexual desire is something that was created. And behold, it was very good. When God looked at the world, it was created at the moment of creation. And it is something we cannot possibly try to control, try to ignore, try to eradicate. It is there. It is a basic function of man. Okay, next sources. So those were a little bit, again, stories are often a wonderful way to hear the voices of Judaism at the beginning of Rabbinic Judaism. And largely, again, I could have brought you many, many, many stories. Although there are stories that express concern, largely the stories reflect the realistic challenge people have in feeling sexuality and channeling it lawfully. Okay, and then we can be sanctified. Okay, next, you shall be called holy, kadoshim to you. Next section. וידבר אדוני אל משה לאמור, דבר אל כל עדת בני ישראל ואמרת עליהם, קדושים תהיו, כי קדוש אני אדוני אלוהיכם. You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. And I already mentioned that at the beginning. Rashi has something very interesting to say here. Speak to the entire congregation of the children of Israel. So now I'm skipping to the medieval period, which is a significant period because the Middle Ages in general were a time of if the world had been very progressive up to the Middle Ages, in the Middle Ages it was regressive, and in sexuality as well, there was kind of a regression, a feeling that we need to hunker down and not be overly sexual. Speak to the entire congregation of the children of Israel. This teaches us that this passage is stated in the assembly of the entire congregation because most of the fundamental teachings of the Torah are dependent on it. You shall be holy. Separate yourselves from sexual immorality and from sin, for wherever one finds offense around sexual immorality, one finds holiness. So Rashi essentially pins the entire mandate of you shall be holy upon avoiding sexual immorality, not avoiding sexual relations, right? Sexual immorality, which is defined in chapter 18 in the way it's defined, the list of largely, again, incest, adultery, bestiality, and so on, right? Now, that means if you separate from sexual immorality, then you shall be holy. You will find holiness there. Look at what Nachmanides says, Ramban. According to my opinion, this separation is not to separate from sins of sexual transgression. I mean, that's it? That's the beginning and the end of Kedoshim to you? Well, that seems a little limited. Meaning, you mean if I spend my life not committing adultery or incest or bestiality, I'll be holy? That's it? I'm holy? No, it requires a little bit more than that, says the Ramban. But notice that Rashi is very, understands that, sexuality is here to stay, and the most we can do is build our fences around sexual immorality to create Kedusha. This separation is not to separate from sins of sexual transgression, like the words of the rabbi, and he disagrees with Rashi. Rather, the separation is that which is mentioned in many places in the Talmud, in those who practice self-control and are called separate. The meaning thereof is as follows. The Torah admonished us against immorality and forbidden foods, but the Torah also allows sexual relations between husband and wife, and allows meeting of meats and wines. If so, a man of desire can find a way to be passionately steeped in sexual promiscuity with his wife or wives, or be among wine bibbers, among gluttonous eaters of flesh, and speak freely all profanities, because there's no prohibition to curse, as long as you don't use God's name, right? There's no prohibition to use coarse language, there's no explicit. This prohibition has not been expressly mentioned in the Torah, and he will thus become a sordid person with the permission of the Torah, what's called Naval Barashut HaTorah, sordid, a base person. Again, it's a wonderful image, and unfortunately I think we all know people who are very makpid, very careful to follow strict letter of the law and every nuance and every hashka, their kashrus is impeccable, and yet when you look at them you feel that they're sorted with the permission of the Torah, right? That idea that people living navalver, you can use the Torah and live the life of Torah, and if you don't get this idea of what it means to sanctify yourself, and again, to think about the food you're eating and where it's coming from, okay? Not to be overly gluttonous, not to get drunk every night, even though you could, right? There's nothing wrong, no prohibition to get drunk, and I made my bracha, I made my blessing before and I made my blessing after. And again, sexual promiscuity with his wife, which again is obviously a subjective criteria, but overly, maybe watching, we can say there's no prohibition to watch porn if you're watching it with your wife, right? Now again, if that's something that is good for the couple, by all means. But in general, I would be judgmental. But a man who would, for instance, prepare to be with his wife after watching hours of porn, I think we can all agree that's Naval Barashut HaTorah. Again, at the end of the day, he's getting into bed with his wife, but there's something sordid about using that vehicle. Therefore, after having listed the matters which he prohibited altogether, Scripture followed them up by a general command. We practice moderation even in matters which are permitted. Okay? And that's a very important philosophy in the Ramban. Moderation, be moderate. Don't be overly extreme to be overly stringent, to be overly lenient. The middle path, which Rambam talks about. Here, the Ramban calls it moderation. Okay, are there limits? So now I'm going to bring you a very interesting piece of Talmud. Again, you may have heard it, you may not have heard it. Rabbi Yochanan ben Dabai said, when the Ramban, now I'm going backwards, again, I'm not on a chronological timeline, you'll forgive me, again, when I bring sources, I'm looking at different voices. I'm going backwards to the Talmud. I was in 1200 CE, and I'm now back in 600 CE. Rabbi Yochanan ben Dabai said, the ministering angels told me 4 things. People are born lame because their parents overturn their table. Just to be clear, unnatural cohabitation via shalot kedarka, and the Talmud, it's anal sex. Okay, that's what they're talking about. 2,000 years ago, they knew all about everything. Okay, so Rabbi Yochanan ben Dabai brings the angels as his source that it causes children to be born with mutations. Dumb because they kiss that place referring to the female sexual organ. Deaf because they converse during cohabitation. Blind because they look at that place. Okay, that seems somewhat restrictive, whereas Rabbi Yochanan ben Dabai getting this, the ministering angels. Okay, let's see how the Talmud continues. Ima Shalom was asked, why are your children so exceedingly beautiful? She replied, because he, my husband, converses with me neither at the beginning nor at the end of the night, but only at midnight. And when he converses, he uncovers a handbreadth and covers a handbreadth, and as though he were compelled by a demon. And when I asked him, what is the reason for this, for choosing midnight, he replied, so that I might not think of another woman, lest my children be as bastards. Okay, which wouldn't really result in Mamzerim. I'm going to talk about this piece of the Talmud, but I want to get to the last piece. Rabbi Yochanan said, the above is the view of Rabbi Yochanan ben Dabai, but our sages said the halacha is not as Rabbi Yochanan ben Dabai. A man may do whatever he pleases with his wife in intercourse. A woman once came before Rebbe and said, Rebbe, the same piece of Talmud, I set a table before my husband, but he overturned it. Rebbe replied, my daughter, the Torah has permitted you to him. What then can I do for you? I'll just say again, this is just one story. The Talmud actually continues with the comparisons to fish and meat, and you can braise and broil and steam and fry your fish, or braise and broil or steam or fry your meat. We won't talk about the overlap between food and sex. It comes up a lot, in all cultures, okay? But what Rebbe is saying is, everything is permitted. There's no problem. He wants to overturn the table. He can overturn the table. Now, it's 100% clear in halachic literature and rabbinic text. It all has to be consensual. There's no such thing. There is no such, marital rape is not sanctioned in Judaism. I'll just say there is no such thing. A woman can sue her husband for damages if he tries to rape her or rapes her during marriage. There is no such thing as marital rape.
I just want to say on that, though, that Tosfos and Sanhedrin says that that's only on occasion. So everything's permitted.
I'm going to get to that. Remember, Tosfot, Middle Ages, Christian, Ashkenaz, yes. Yes, Tosfot begins to limit it, and we begin to see that from the Tosfot homage of 1300. It makes sense. I'm going back to the earliest piece of Talmudic, because the Ramah Haskins like the Tosfot, okay? So what we see here are really two voices. The voices of Rabbi Yochanan ben Dabai, which end up becoming very much echoed by the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah very much feeling midnight is the ideal time to have sex, in the dark, uncovering a little and covering a little, and so on. And certainly not practicing anything too exciting or experimental. And yet, the dominant voice in the Talmud is that a man can do whatever he wants with his wife, and those two voices continue. Meaning, if we talk about the halachic literature, Maimonides very much paskins that a man can do whatever he wants with his wife, b'yesha kedarka v'shelo kedarka. Ideally, one of the concerns is hashchatat zera, that a man not waste his seed. However, it's fairly clear from the Rambam and then the Ramah that if the wasting of the seed, so to speak, is in the context of the sexual pleasuring of one's wife or sexual relationship, it would be permitted. Whereas the second voice that emerges almost in parallel in the Middle Ages and onward is the voice of Rabbi Yochanan ben Dabai, with the Torah and Shulchan Aruch agreeing we don't paskin like Rabbi Yochanan ben Dabai, but maybe we should take him into consideration. I mean, there is a consideration here. Rabbi Yochanan ben Dabai, he wants to limit it to a very specific type of sexual relation, and one should be more modest, and so on and so forth. And I'm going to leave those two voices because, again, I'll talk a little bit about what's going on in the therapeutic world and the professional world today, and the consequence of listening to Rabbi Yochanan ben Dabai too much. Okay, I'm going to come back to that, but ultimately, we seem to have a split between whether, a man can do whatever he pleases, and we're going to see in a moment that the mitzvah of sexual pleasure is from the husband to the wife. Again, so the wife is entitled to sexual pleasure, and again, the question is that only limited to midnight with uncovering in one position and so on and so forth? Or in the name of pleasuring one's wife, one can go outside the table, so to speak, overturn the table. We'll come back to that. Okay, Shulchan Aruch. And again, I'm just saying to the right. Okay. Everyone is obligated to be intimate with his wife on the nights when she immerses and when he leaves on a journey if he is not traveling for a mitzvah purpose. Likewise, if one's wife is nursing and he notices she is coaxing him and enticing him and adorning herself in his presence so that he will give her his attention, he is obligated to be intimate with her. And so here the Shulchan Aruch and Aruch Chaim brings a lot of the two voices, I would say. Rabbi Yochanan ben Dabai, the Shulchan Aruch himself seems to be drawn more towards the Kabbalistic approach, which is a more restrictive sexual approach. But this idea of being intimate with your wife and picking up on her cues, very insightful. Because we see, even if you read Cosmo, you read Vanity Fair, not that I recommend them, but it's always about how to get him to pay attention when you're in the mood kind of thing. This idea that women have a harder time directly asking and have all sorts of cues, whether they put on their, they adorn themselves, put on the earrings that are normally a sign like, honey, tonight's a good night, and so on, requires the man to pay more attention. It's an interesting shift. Because largely we're used to the idea, certainly in Anglo-Saxon law, that it's the man's right and the woman's duty, and as a result, marital rape remained legal. There was no such thing, I should say. Marital rape was not defined as rape in the United States in some states until the 90s. I mean, went that from the 80s, 90s, and so on, that there was no such thing. You couldn't rape your wife. She had a duty. She had an obligation. There was no such thing, right? Anglo-Saxon law said it was a man's right and a woman's duty. Judaism has always defined it as the woman's right and the man's duty. That said, if a woman withholds sexual relations for too long a period of time, he can demand a divorce, meaning sexual relations are at the center of the Jewish marriage, meaning both of them are entitled to regular sexual relations, but the burden of pleasure is on the husband, not on the wife. So again, very interesting, and I would say for 2,000 years ago, rather progressive. Yeah, sure.
There's no voices of an obligation like that for the wife?
No, in terms of giving the husband sexual pleasure?
Yes.
It's not, The assumption is, it's easier, again, the assumption in the rabbinic text, it's easier for a man to take sexual pleasure or to know what his sexual pleasure is. And so the mitzvah or the burden or responsibility is on him. That doesn't mean, again, if his wife is refusing or is not consensually engaging in sexual relations, that there isn't a fundamental problem with the marriage that the rabbinic court will take seriously, right? If a man comes and says, look, she says no all the time, or when she says yes, it's like so clear she's not interested, and so they'll take that seriously. But the mitzvah, like if we open the 613 mitzvahs, is on the man. And I'm just going to, again, I brought the Ramah for lack of time on page 7. You can see a man can do with his wife as he pleases, have sexual intercourse anytime that he desires with any organ he desires, have natural, unnatural, or between the legs, as long as he does not waste semen. Meaning, what does that mean? If it's between the legs, what does that mean to waste semen? So again, very interesting halachic discourse as can it be wasting semen if it's in the course of having sexual relations? Meaning, it's one thing, the unpleasant vision of a man in a car, Hugh Grant, right? Unfortunately, we all know about Hugh Grant from many years ago. And what was her name? I don't remember the name of the prostitute. Something Brown, Divine Brown or something Divine, thank you. Divine Brown. That would not be acceptable, if the woman is only giving the man sexual pleasure and so that he has, and there's no intimacy and no relationship, that would be a problem, it seems, in the Ramah. There are those who are lenient and say unnatural intercourse is allowed even if he emits semen, if it is done randomly, which is what you were talking about, the Tosfot being randomly on occasion, and he is not accustomed to this, it's not the regular way. And even though all of this is permitted, all who sanctify themselves with what is permitted to them, sanctified, they will say he's kadosh. A conversation I had with a rabbi I consult with, I said to him, well, I go to a lot of lectures, I hear the therapists, and what the therapists say, the Orthodox therapist is, when you limit sexual relations to vaginal intercourse, you lose something, because there are a lot of different ways of achieving sexual pleasure, and as a result, the couple is often very frustrated. The couple often is very limited, and there are times where the woman really isn't physically capable, and then if her husband's respectful, then he'll, okay dear, I understand. And then you've essentially taken sexuality off the table. Now what happens is, all these therapists will say, that when you go to the rabbinic authorities and you say, look, there's a problem here. The woman can't have that kind of sexual relations because she has a wound, or she's in pain, or it's after childbirth, or she has a condition which causes her to freeze up, and so on and so forth. More or less, the Satmar down to the modern Orthodox, rabbis will say, oh, there's a problem. Of course, the couple should continue to find ways to sexually pleasure one another and build up towards what is considered via shekitar. However, one of the things I brought to the attention, I said, why do we only present it as a de facto when we have the Ramah? He said, well, of course we don't. It's a lechatchila. We do paskin like the Ramah. I said, yeah, well, not enough rabbis are willing to be upfront about that. Meaning, here we have the Talmud, who says clearly we don't rule like Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. We have the Rambam and then the Ramah who say we don't rule like Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Why have we kind of gone backwards and limited couples to, the nighttime and in the dark and one position and so on and so forth? And so that becomes an interesting question. I don't have a final answer. I would say again, what happened in the Middle Ages and onward, and again, in parallel with other traditions and other cultures, was very restrictive. And today I think we have a mandate to kind of break out and allow couples to be more experimental, largely because the need is so great. And I'll come back to that, okay? The right to sexual pleasure in the marital relationship. Judaism did not overlook or underestimate the physical aspects of marriage. On the contrary, once sacrificial withdrawal from the sinful, this is rough celibation, sinful erotic paradise of change of variety is completed, the natural element in marriage comes to the fore. The two partners owe each other not only fidelity, but also full gratification of their sexual needs. Refusal or failure by one of the partners to satisfy the conjugal rights of the other is sufficient reason to divorce, which comes back to what you asked. Each one must observe these laws of consortium with regard to the other. The marriage must not be converted into an exclusively spiritual fellowship. Marriage without carnal enjoyment and erotic love is contrary to human nature and is to be dissolved. And he wrote this, I don't know if it was in the 60s or the 70s, in a book called Family Redeemed. But certainly, again, the Stoliner Rebbe has a very long tshuva or responsa in which he details how a man is to give his wife sexual pleasure. It's almost like I teach a class called Sexuality and Sanctity at Pardes, and I co-teach it with Rabbi Rachel Berkowitz, and she translated the whole area. It's the Steipler, the Steipler, and it's so explicit that I was blushing. I'm like, my husband, bring this much detail about how we actually, and she's like, no, it's the snipe and so on. So we kind of have, we go back and forth, how explicit should we, even though they're Jewish sources, how explicit do we want them to be? And so this idea that carnal enjoyment is at the basis of human interaction, of committed human interaction, and in this I'll take it a little bit outside the box shortly, I'm just building up to that. Exodus, again, here we have the pasuk in Shemot, this idea of when a man is, committed to a handmaiden. I don't want to go into details, but he essentially marries her and brings her into his home. Even if he takes another wife, he must give her food, clothing, conjugal rights. That's where the idea comes that in marriage, a woman is entitled to 3 things: food, clothing, and sexual relations. Okay, not just the basis for the marriage. Rav Moshe Feinstein, again, a very insightful idea, and then the next 2 sources may be surprising to you. In my humble opinion, it appears that the primary obligation of Onah is when the husband sees that she desires him. But thus we see that he explains in the verse in the manner that her Onah should not diminish. He must make her happy, give her pleasure when he sees that she is desirous of him, and similarly when he is leaving on a trip. Okay. Thus we see that when the woman is yearning and desirous, that creates the biblical mitzvah Onah. It stands to reason this is the primary mitzvah. But because most women are modest and their desire is not always so evident, and certainly in the more ultra-Orthodox or restricted, traditional, conservative homes this would be the case, there are many men who will not recognize their wives are desirous by the affectionate signal she shows him. The sages established fixed times. And again, in Ketubot, we looked at what the fixed times were. It was by profession. The most shocking one is the unemployed man who's independently wealthy. What's called the tayal, because he wanders around town all day. He's the tayalim. He has to have sex with his wife every day. And now that doesn't mean it has to be consensual and respectful and so on and so forth. But Rav Moshe goes on in this piece, I didn't have room to bring it. He says something fantastic. He says, look, the wife is going to look at the husband. He has nothing else to do. And she's going to think, well, I've been raised to believe that men, especially when they have time on their hands, are sexual creatures. And if he doesn't want to have sex with me every day, what does that mean? He obviously doesn't find me attractive. And so he's trying to address why Dafka, an independently wealthy man, has a greater obligation than the Torah scholar, than the donkey driver, than the camel, because he has nothing else to do, and I'll add to that. The concern is idle hands are a devil's work, right? That a man who's going out to town every day is going to see things and interact with women and in the market and flirt and so on. Let him come home and channel his energy, if you will. And it's a very actually insightful, again, as long as it's consensual. But Rav Moshe adds this piece that there's such a burden on a man who has endless wealth and endless time, because she'll be thinking, well, why doesn't he want me if he doesn't come home every day? And again, this concern that the woman will feel neglected or unattractive and so on is not a small concern that comes out in the sources. Again, something to think about. In 1408 in Spain, actually he died in 1408, the Rivash, a question comes, and I bring this because we always feel like we're so new and so edgy and promiscuous and so on. Can we let single women go to the mikvah? That's the question that comes before the Rivash. The idea being that once single women, the big problem with premarital sex is what? Having sexual relations with a woman who menstruated and did not go to the mikvah. Right? That's it. That's it, according to biblical law. So what do? We don't let single women go to the mikvah. And that ends up being the response, and it's been the response for several thousand years. Now that we don't have a temple, we don't have to go up to the temple and eat the Korban Pesach, single women or young girls don't have to go to the mikvah, and as a result, they're nida. And since they're nida, you can't have sexual relations, because then it's a really big prohibition, right? The consequence is kari, which is divine excommunication, whatever that means. Okay. So the Rivash is asked in the 1400s, it's the 1300s, because he dies in 1408, well, why don't we just allow all women to go to the mikvah? And then, when there are little accidents here and there, and the Talmud is really familiar with premarital sex. I mean, Ketubot is filled with all the women who aren't virgins when they get married. And there, on one hand, is this, well, virgins are worth more. On the other hand, there's actually a very forgiving attitude towards women who are not virgins. It was an accident, and I made a mistake, and Yaakov, and what can I do, and so on and so on. And it was before we were engaged, and I didn't want to tell anyone, or the couple that's allowed to walk in the moonlight, and blah, blah. So again, the Talmud is very actually forgiving. There is no such thing as honor killings in Judaism. Okay? And so,
is there a case of that?
What?
Of an honor killing in the Talmud ever?
No, not for this. Not for this. No. There are ideas that if you see a man running after a married woman to rape her, right, you're allowed to kill him. That the Good Samaritan Act we see, but no such thing as honor killing. Okay. And no one ever did. So what does he say? Essentially, he says sex with a menstruating woman is forbidden whether she is his wife or she is unmarried, and that is clear. And even speaking about it is unnecessary. It says, to a menstruating woman, do not come near, and it made no distinction between one's wife and an unmarried woman, for it did not say to your wife. So again, it's interesting, in 1300, he's being honest. And at the end of the day, it says you can't have sex with a menstruating woman. It doesn't say your wife who is menstruating, right? And so, again, we don't find marriage codified in the Torah. It comes later, this idea of kiddushin. We have divorce, but we don't have an actual act or a mitzvah to get married, if you will. But once you're married, you have a mitzvah to provide food, clothing, and sex. And so here he says, look, the prohibition on the nida is whether she's married or unmarried. Interesting question is, what about a non-Jewish woman? Because that wouldn't apply. The whole idea of nida would only be for a Jewish woman. I thought for a long time there wouldn't be a prohibition, which would explain to me the 42nd Street phenomena of some, it's not really a myth, but the idea that some Jewish men will choose to have sexual relations or affairs with non-Jewish women, because then you get out of the nida thing. But it turns out that's not true, because I found an explicit prohibition in the Talmud, because it's walking in the ways of the daughters of Canaan. So maybe not everyone knows that.
Yeah, but excuse me, sorry, but anyway, there's the whole problem of spitting of semen. So
that's an interesting question. Well, is there? It's not clear you spill semen or you seed when you're actually engaged in the sexual relationship, as long as it's inside the woman. But then if it's yeah, that's a good question. That's a good point. But the myth had always been better to have an affair or premarital sex with a non-Jewish woman, because then you don't have the nida issue. The spilling of seed is not biblical, by the way. There's no biblical prohibition. It's rabbinic. So again, if we're categorizing our prohibitions and saying, look, I want to stay away from biblical, but rabbinic, I can do my tshuva on Yom Kippur. Biblical, that's a big deal. Karet is a big deal. The preferred method has been, well, I'll go with a non-Jewish woman, but she doesn't, nida doesn't apply to her. Yes.
There's a story in Parashat Vayeshev, Er ve'onan.
Yes, I know. No one codifies law based on Er and Onan. That's not, onanism is not, that's not correct. No one uses that. The book of Genesis is not a source of halacha, except for
even
that. It's a story. It's a story. It's not. No one refers to that as the source for the halacha, and the rabbinic literature struggles because they'd like a biblical text. They don't have one. There is no biblical text that serves as a source of a negative prohibition. Again, I'm being very careful.
God's halacha
There's
is necessarily
biblical law and rabbinic law. In the world of legal codes, biblical law is like up here, rabbinic law is down here, and the feeling is the punishment for biblical law is much more severe, accountability is much more severe up here. Rabbinic law comes to interpret biblical law, to add to it, to fences around it, but it's not the same level of severity. So in general, if I'm going to transgress, it's always better to transgress rabbinic law than biblical law. Biblical law is largely you're only going to transgress if your life is in danger, whereas rabbinic laws might be tremendous financial loss, tremendous, there's even a story, hold on one second, in the Talmud, a man comes with terrible sexual urges, and he's basically told to put on dark clothes and go to another town and have sex with a prostitute. Meaning, again, that would be a rabbinic transgression, not a biblical, and I don't have time to go into that. Yes?
Maybe you can answer a question, actually. I've always wondered about that story. It sounds as if the real prohibition is that he didn't give his wife the opportunity to have a baby,
yes.
Because at that time they sometimes had concubines that they would not get pregnant, not to spoil their beauty. It was really being unfair to the woman.
Oh, absolutely.
So I was wondering if that is the main point about it.
Yeah, the main point of Onan is that he deliberately spills his seed on the ground. He practices coitus interruptus, if you will, in order not to impregnate her. Now, I saw a wonderful tshuva by someone who was in the Lithuanian yeshiva world, who was trying to beautifully, bringing all sorts of Rishonim and Achronim, argue that masturbation would not be a problem unless a man was masturbating in order to avoid impregnating his wife. Using he wasn't using that as the main source, but showing really interesting sources that seem to say that from the Middle Ages, that's what the ultimate definition of wasting seed would ultimately be what Onan did, right? Which is deliberately, not because a 15-year-old has an urge that he can't control, but having a wife and then deliberately not impregnating. He was answering, again, I hate wasting time, but it's actually an important point. He was in this Lithuanian yeshiva world, and he had a student he was very close with who did not tell him how much he was struggling not to masturbate, not to waste seed, and ended up really injuring himself and ending up in the hospital with an unfortunate injury. And he felt that the yeshiva world had gone too far in the guilt and the sense of closeness and secrecy and so on and so forth. And so he was trying to find a halachic answer for young men who were not married. He said, and in marriage, then certainly if it's in the context of the sexual relationship and pleasuring your wife, there wouldn't be wasting seed. What he would define as wasting seed would be this idea of spilling seed so as not to impregnate it. And he uses that idea very strongly and very convincingly. Of course, he's a lone voice, and no one's going to take a lone voice seriously. He's out there. He's on the internet. You can find him. I have the name of the tshuva. Very, very long, page after page after page of explanation. Okay, so we have the Rivash, and ultimately what the Rivash says is, if she would immerse, now this is very interesting. What does he say? He says no. She would be a real stumbling block, because the people would be lenient on the prohibition of premarital sex, since the prohibition would be rabbinic. There is no biblical prohibition. It's a rabbinic prohibition, and it's a questionable rabbinic prohibition. Meaning once the woman goes to the mikvah, Rabbi Yehuda says it's a question. I mean, no one has an absolute answer about premarital sex, and no one really wants people to know that. But he goes on and ends by saying, and the bigger problem will be, if some women immerse when they're not married, then men will assume all unmarried women have immersed, and may come to have relations with women who's made up incidentally, accidentally. Wow, that would be a real problem. So he closes down the whole thing. Even though basically what they're saying is, look, it's happening, Rav Rivash. Meaning, we have a situation where men are having premarital sex with young maidens, and they're nidot. Shouldn't we avoid that program? Well, we're not going to allow that. Now, in this next piece, which, again, in order to have some time for closing remarks, does a mikvah make premarital sex kosher? I bring something from 2008, because this, of course, has been the big question, whether mikvahs can allow single women to immerse, right? It's been a huge fight, in the last 7 years. Rav Metzger, when he was chief Ashkenazi rabbi, issued a prohibition against unmarried women immersing themselves in the mikvah, which led 2 women to go to the Bagatz. When they went to the Supreme Court, they petitioned. They said, look, taxpayers' money goes into building mikvahs. Mikvahs should be open to all. There's no reason that anyone should ask questions: who's married, who's single. The mikvahs are a public institution, which is true. It's different in other countries where obviously private communities build mikvahs. There are almost no. I think there have been 2 that have been built, but there are no private mikvahs in Israel. They're public institutions, and as such, all women should be allowed to go. And so she draws a picture. Again, I urge you to read it. There's one line I want to take out. She's a woman who grew up Orthodox. She said, look, I knew that a religious community going to the mikvah in order to make premarital sex kosher was absolutely taboo. Barring conversion, a girl would only go to the mikvah on her wedding day, and so on and so forth. And then she meets Ben. He was sweet, smart, funny. I'm on page 9, the last page, and attractive. And we had a kind of chemistry that I wouldn't have believed it existed if I hadn't experienced it myself. And then she starts sleeping with him. They're having sex, and she decides, you know what, I'm going to go to the mikvah. And she has one line that I thought was very powerful. Though it made me uncomfortable, about halfway through, and anxious, it also seemed appropriate to make myself completely vulnerable, literally naked, in front of God, in preparation for being vulnerable and naked with my boyfriend. The simple fact is that Ben and I would have sex that weekend whether or not I went to the mikvah. According to halacha, the punishment should have been excommunication, being cut off from the community and probably premature death. Ben and I had previously transgressed the rule against premarital sex, so maybe we were already screwed, no pun intended. But by going to the mikvah, I was changing our pattern. Instead of ignoring halacha altogether, I was doing my best to reconcile it with my actions. I recognize it isn't the ideal scenario, but I bet it's a pretty common one, okay, and so on and so forth. And basically, the last line, a prohibition might stop some women from going to the mikvah. It won't stop couples from engaging in premarital sex. And this is where I really want to end and have a few closing words, in that I think what is confronting us today is, until 15, 20, 30 years ago, this idea that all Kedoshim Tiyu really was limited to the heterosexual couple, marrying under the chuppah, going to the mikvah, having, vanilla sex, as 50 Shades of Grey calls it, right? Having that kind of sex, and that's it, and so on and so forth, has really been challenged. And it's been challenged by a lot of things. It's been challenged by many young couples in the Orthodox community, let alone outside, right? Couples in general having premarital sex, with studies showing a rising number, ironically, if you will, of religious women, and this would be in Christianity as well, having oral and anal sex in order to avoid vaginal sex so that the woman is still a virgin, right? The virginity that we have to, and so that's what they're engaging in, and the numbers are of younger and younger people going further and further, if you will, of those who are doing studies. That's one thing that came to my attention. The fact that homosexuality is on the rise, that there are many committed homosexual relationships. As I said, I've taught two lesbian couples, one of whom is Orthodox and cover their hair and go to the mikvah and so on. And people are looking for sanctity in Judaism, and they're looking for sanctity in their sexual relationships. Now, I always say, and I've said this to students as well, junk sets cannot be sanctified. Tinder cannot be sanctified. Hookups cannot be sanctified. Sanctity means holiness, spirituality, sacredness, godliness in one's sexual relationship. But I do think that people who are engaged in committed premarital or homosexual relationships can look to some of these sources, again, not in a halachic way. I'm not standing here as a halachic authority, but in a Jewish way, can use some of Judaism's kind of proactive attitude and very positive attitude towards the sexual core of the human interaction in a committed relationship and incorporate and adopt some of those ideas in order to sanctify their own relationships. And I think we need to educate, again, I would much rather see our young children in committed premarital relationships having premarital sex. Obviously, we want them to get married, right? But let's say that's not happening and they're getting married later and some of them are engaged in premarital sex. I would much rather it be sanctified than it be kind of, well, I've already gone off the derech, I might as well just become a Tinderella or look for a Tinderella. That would be very sad to me, and I would feel that, not just me, I would feel the religion has failed in giving any sort of support or tools to those who are looking for sanctity. We're saying, well, you're outside the box, so no sanctity for you. There would be a tremendous failure, and I think a disservice to a lot of the sources that we saw today. So I have a few minutes for questions. I just want to thank you. Certainly, you can find me on Facebook or on the Pardes website. My email is nechamabarash@gmail.com. It's very easy to remember. And if you have any questions or anything you want to address, I'm happy to take them now. I have 3 minutes. So anyone have something they want? 3 minutes for questions, and then you can talk to me during the break. Yes?
Are the laws of Nida a book? Like, where do they originate from?
The laws of
Nida
Nida-
that women are injured.
Chapter 18 of Leviticus is the prohibition, and chapter 20 is the punishment, which is excommunication. The laws of Nida, just for those who require a woman to finish her menstruation, and the rabbis added 7 days clean of bleeding before going to the mikvah, also based on Leviticus 18. They didn't make it up. Meaning again, I teach a class on Nida. I don't have time to go into it. I was once in Stockholm speaking, and I was teaching a class on mikvah and Nida, and they're like, wow, this is so misogynistic and so did the woman. And I said, listen, what they did with men and wasting seed was equally burdensome, restricting, and suffocating. Meaning, if we want to talk about parallels, I would say that men and women, if you want to look for kind of a restrictive attitude towards menstrual blood versus seminal fluid, you've got it. You've got it. So I don't want to say it's only about the woman and restricting the woman. The men have plenty of their own restrictions on their sexuality. The question is, how can we work within that? So. It's a hook, yeah, a hook in the sense that it's a biblical law that has no reason. Yes. Anyone else have a question they want to clarify? Okay, well, thank you very much.